proceedings, and a huge thank you on behalf of SARISI to you, Prof, for taking the time out of your very full schedule to share your knowledge with us. I am Julietta Harrison, President for SARISI, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's proceedings. Just a reminder to our colleagues to please keep yourself muted until such time as Prof Jansen has finished. And then obviously, if you want to ask questions, just raise your hand or pop something in the chat. So without further ado, Prof, welcome. We look forward to hearing your words of wisdom.
Thank you very much, Julietta, and welcome to everyone on this line. It is a great privilege to be with you. Now, as many of you know, my immediate field of expertise is not early education, but much more by profession, high school teaching, and then for most of my life since, I've been either involved in leadership in higher education and of course research on universities, and to a lesser extent these days on schools. And so whatever I have to say to you today will have to be, taken with a pinch of salt, I suppose, given that so many of you work at the interface of policy, research, and practice when it comes to early education research. So I was fascinated by the focus of this particular stakeholders meeting, which read as, how does SARISI develop a responsive ECE research strategy for South Africa? So I'm going to speak to that question and ask what are some of the key problems with early education research as I see it. And I have to say right off the cuff that what the problems I'm going to mention is not too different from educational research in South Africa generally. And so what I say to you in the specialist community concerned with early education might very well apply in part or in the whole to the education research landscape across the country. I also have to say, in preparation for today, I did a quick review of the last few issues of the South African Journal of Childhood Education, just to get a sense as to what it is people are researching, what they're talking about as a way of, preparing my talk with you for today. So I'm going to be fairly direct with you about what I see as 7 key problems with early education research in South Africa. Feel free to challenge me in the Q&A or in the chat room or wherever, but this is what I see as I work with colleagues in early education. So I think your research agenda has 7 problems, at least. The one I'm going to call the problem of small imaginations. And so when you look at research in early education, it's typically the single case study, the 3 children, the 5 teachers, or opportunistically, the captive audience of a preset B.Ed class. All of that is, of course, acceptable. The problem is it dominates the early education research landscape to the exclusion of other ways of imagining research. And that is a problem. It certainly is also true in teacher education research and in higher ed studies, etc. And I find this completely unhelpful to developing a long-term research agenda that takes us out of these singularities, these simplicities, these, not only because of the lack of the problem of generalizability, and I don't mean that necessarily in a statistical sense, but you need to be able to say something more than the single case. And that is very often where theory, of course, becomes a very important part of the study, because theory allows you to extrapolate beyond the case. But I don't even see that. So many of these studies are deeply atheoretical on the one hand, and very particular on the other hand in terms of its unit of analysis. And that suggests to me that you are in the doldrums as early education researchers because of small imaginations. When I coined the term in preparation for today, small imaginations, I remembered that when I first came back to South Africa in 91, I worked with an early childhood organization by the name of Small Beginnings. I don't know where it was, it might have been Pretoria. But anyway, this is not about small beginnings, this is about small imaginations. And that is a problem, as you'll also see in the other points. So in short, one of the key problems in early education research in South Africa is the problem of small imaginations. Now, by the way, I will send this page of summary notes to the organizers so that you can all hopefully get a copy of this. I prefer not to put up slides. It just seems to be such a distraction in the Zoom intensive period. Number two, in addition to the problem of small imaginations, I suggest that early education research has a problem of normative bent. What do I mean by normative bent? In other words, this research leans towards telling us what should be as opposed to telling us what exists. Now, those of you who do research, who do the training of postgraduate students, masters and doctoral students will realize that in the professions, such as teaching or early childhood, students often come to you with a plan to which the answer is already obvious to them. They come in with a very strong sense of normative commitments to their research project. And it is extremely frustrating for me to explain to students the difference between a church or a mosque on the one hand and a university. Come in with questions, don't come in with answers. Otherwise, why the hell are you here in the first place? And yet this clouds much of what I've read in certainly the Journal of Childhood Education, is that people come in with very strong views ahead of the research about what is appropriate teaching or learning or reasoning or, information technologies and the like. And this normative bent is destroying us because it takes away the role of the researcher as an inquirer. The role of the researcher as somebody who's uncertain about what the outcomes might be, or even what the question might be. And you're not going to get it very far. As I say, this is a problem of the profession. So whether it is clinical psychology or whether it is, teacher education or early childhood or curriculum studies, you really find it difficult to convince a teacher who does research or a psychologist who does research that maybe it is better to look for novel questions before coming in with a very strong belief system. This is what I call then the problem of the normative bent in educational research. By the way, where you saw this completely out of control to this day was in the wake of Rose Must Fall. I cannot tell you how much rubbish has been written in South Africa and abroad in the name of decolonization. because people decide what decolonization is, and then in a very judgmental way, if they don't find what they think it is, they condemn you. Now, I'm very much in favor of radical research, but it's not research if you've already made up your mind. And that is why we've just finished a book, by the way, myself and Cyril Walters. She is one of my postdocs, and it will be published, or should be out fairly soon, through Cambridge University Press. The title is The Decolonization of Knowledge. And what we did is we literally went to 10 of the large universities to try and figure out, A, what they mean by decolonization, and B, whether they actually do it. In other words, 5 years since Rose Must Fall, empirically, what does decolonization look like in the practice of curriculum? Well, surprise, surprise, nothing has really changed. The people who changed were those who changed before Rose Must Fall. In other words, the people in little enclaves on the different campuses who were doing interesting work in terms of, curriculum, pedagogic, teaching, and the like. But there was no shift in what universities do. But you wouldn't know it by the level of the noise, the absolute level of noise, righteous noise, about what should be in the context of decolonization. And I was really glad that I didn't see, except for that rather ridiculous article that my good friend Mark Potterton wrote in his review of Pam Christie's book, Decolonization in the Karoo, for heaven's sake. It's opportunistic, it is politically, I think, naive, it is empirically nonsense. But we need to, as I said, get away from research that is so strongly normative in its incoming orientation that you really don't know how to do, or you don't do really good empirical research. So most of what you see on decolonization to this day is more recognized for its exhortatory excesses. In other words, its language, its highfalutin language, its absolute borrowing of these South American guys who say the same thing for 20 years in a row and think they've been novel, at the expense of empirical depth. And so what we did was quite deliberate in the Decolonization of Knowledge book, which is to say, let's go and look at what people actually do rather than what they say should be, what actually happens. And once again, huge gap between the noise and the reality on the ground. So that's what I'm calling this morning the problem of normative bent in early education research. Number 3, I think what you also have as a problem in much of what I've read in early education research is the problem of a policy-centric bias in research. In other words, much of the research is oriented towards an understanding of government policy, and again, about what should be in the context of early childhood education and development. Now, I understand how this happened. In the early 1990s, I was certainly part of groups organized under the umbrella of NEPI, the National Education Policy Investigation, one aspect of which dealt with early childhood education. These were the policy activists, who came in, many of them, from these courageous and noble NGOs, from grassroots to TREE to Elru and so on. Later on in Tata, you said, but all of them came in with this very strong commitment, political commitment to policy. Policy will fix things. Well, if you still believe that policy will fix things, you've not been paying attention to the past 27 years in our country. Policy doesn't fix things. As I've said repeatedly in my various writings, is there is, in addition to whatever instrumental notion of policy might exist in government, a very strong sense of policy as a symbolic value. In other words, if I can pretend that I have a progressive policy on early childhood education, then that is enough to hopefully sway the masses, mislead the practitioners, and screw everybody else. Policy in our country, especially when it comes to education, is not always intended to change things. It is very often intended to position government on the progressive side of global education developments. Again, there have been hundreds of books written about this, including by colleagues in the sociology of education, John Mayer, Francisco Ramirez, and many others. Hundreds of dissertations have come out of there about how, if I might summarize, the policy responses of governments is really not about, it's really not about implementation.
Ja, dis sy wat praat.
Please put up your mic.
Goed, dankie en self.
Dame, jy is jy's unmuted net. Ons hoor jou telefoongesprek. As dit so sangryp of not. All right. So you get my point. The policy-centric bias. Now my friend Eric Atmore, for whom I have huge respect, Eric pulls his hair out from time to time when government doesn't deliver, in terms of its promises with respect to policies of, regarding staff support, staff salary, staff development in the pandemic. They're not going to do that. That was never the intention. They'll tell you they're doing that, but that's nothing. And this is not about a cynical view of policy. I study policy for a living. It is about understanding its political functions and not only its supposedly pragmatic or practical functions. And so I discourage students these days. I've had enough of them doing this kind of work in the middle to late 90s. I discourage them from doing these gap analyses. This is what the policy says, this is what the practice reveals, and aha, there is a gap between policy and practice. I think I can understand if somebody did that in the mid-90s. It is completely ridiculous to continue doing that kind of research. But in any event, a policy-centric view of early education research is not going to take you anywhere. And so that is, I think, in a segment of your community, a very important weakness, I think, in the research mandate. Number 4, there is also the problem of nationalistic orientation in early education research. In other words, the unit of analysis is the nation or the region or the local community. And there is a dearth of genuinely comparative education research. I'm not saying adding an article on Ghana or an article on Tanzania, as I see in some of these journals. I'm talking about genuinely comparative education research, in which you look at the role of the state, in which you look at the role of capital, in which you look at the role of transnational organizations, but you don't start off with and stay with this narrowly nationalistic view of something that is an international phenomenon and has international pretensions. And that is why very early on, when I tried to develop a research orientation in the Faculty of Education at the University of Pretoria when I became dean, and we had absorbed a group of really competent education teachers, lecturers from the Normal College Pretoria, outstanding people like, Annelie and and others. I learned so much from them. But they weren't theoreticians, they weren't comparativists. They weren't researchers at the time. They were really just really, really good practitioners. The first thing I did, some of you might recall, in trying to develop a broader comparative perspective on what we were doing, was to bring in international scholars like Manjula from Australia and others to help us break out of this rather ethnocentric account of early education research, which I think is dangerous, in part because we then end up thinking we're exceptional, and in part because we then really isolate the research to the point of being meaningless when so much has happened around the world that could be helpful. And so there is a problem of nationalistic orientation in early education research. Number 5, there is also, in my view, the problem of what I call the critical unconscious in early education research in South Africa. Truth is, when I read the many, many articles that I did, there is still this liberal, missionary-oriented, helping hand ideology that underpins early education research in South Africa. It is so infused with the notion of rescuing the poor and the disadvantaged child that it doesn't understand its major dilemma, which is the singular lack of criticality in the conception and the conduct of early education research. So occasionally you would see somebody writing an article on Foucault in relation to early education. I saw 1 or 2 of those. But by and large, there is, in theoretical terms, the critical unconscious. And the reason for that is really simple. The people who come into master's and doctoral degrees in early education are often people who've come from the practice of early education. And so you've come in with an institutional understanding that is very much shaped by a rescue the perishing sense of what it means to work in ECD. That is dangerous at so many different levels. And by the way, this is not simply a Christian dilemma. This is as much a Muslim, a Jewish, take your pick dilemma, because of the overwhelming ideological orientation towards helping others. And that, of course, is what we do. We help others. That's not my point. My point is that then infuses the research mind with what I call here the critical unconscious, and so on. So this implies, obviously, a theoretical orientation that is much deeper than simply criticizing the government. This is about finding new frameworks that help us understand what it means to do early education research. Now, I want to push here, if I may just put in this footnote, for plurality. In other words, for many different ways of approaching the subject. So what decolonization did, it became the new orthodoxy in certainly much of South Africa's educational and social science research, the new orthodoxy. So you replace whatever you were doing before with this new evangelical tract. I can't tell you what damage that has done to both decolonization as a radical project, in my view, as well as to the conduct of educational research, the critical unconscious. Number 6, I also want to refer to what I call the problem of immediatism in early education research in South Africa. That is, almost all the studies I looked at the problem of ECD as a contemporaneous dilemma, set of dilemmas, and so on. So that immediately cuts out 2 angles on early education research. The one is a historical angle. We really should by now have had, many, many studies, critical studies on the history of early childhood education, its ideological pretensions, its colonial connections, its apartheid shapings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, instead of just focusing on the year now. And so the year now approach, as I said, takes out the possibility of genuinely scholarly historical studies on the roots of the evolution of early childhood education, especially in its colonial manifestations. But there is another angle that it excludes from consideration in this respect, and that is longitudinal studies. It is and should be a point of embarrassment within your community of early education researchers that the only known longitudinal study on childhood was done by psychologists and sociologists outside of our field, and that I refer to Linda Richter's leadership of Birth to 12, a massive, rich a base of research that allows, of course, for secondary research to be able to be done by master's and doctoral students for years to come. Where is that stream of longitudinal research in the context of early education and beyond? Doesn't exist as far as I know. And that is a poverty that makes it very, very difficult to develop a research program as opposed to a research project, which is the year now, the immediate, and so on and so forth. And then seventh, I think this is perhaps going to be one of the more sensitive points, but I have to make this in the context of what you asked me to do. And that is the problem of the juniorization rather, in the ranks of the early education research community. There is a distinct lack of senior scholars with upper B and A ratings who lead the research agenda in the early education community. And that is a massive, massive problem. You can literally count on one hand the timelines that are suitable. You can literally count on one hand the number of people that they point you to. So my friend Linda Bosman, everybody would point to Linda, everybody would point to Asina Ibrahim, everybody would point to that Northwest colleague, Sands Beard or something. But it's literally a handful of people. This is not good enough. Now, I can hear you saying, but isn't that also true across the board as far as educational research is that we don't have a lot of upper B's and A's? That is true. But this is, for me, what should be your plan. So you can't develop, very high-ranking research in early education in a bubble. Or in a vacuum. You've got to do this on the basis of a conscious decision as an organization to develop the next generation of senior professors, senior scholars in early education research. I don't see them yet. I see one or two promising people, but I'm talking here about, young scholars whose PhDs blew out the window. I'm talking about young scholars who've already worked on their first single-authored book. I'm talking about young scholars who have generated new concepts, new ideas, new methodologies for understanding early education research. In other words, people who show signs of intellectual life. I want to propose to you that if you found 5 to 10 of those people, young people, when I say young, I mean young in terms of their scholarly careers, and you make massive investments in them to become, the leading researchers on this continent, if not in the world, in early education. That's a 10 to 15-year project, but it is worth doing. You can't solve this problem of, as I said, fairly shallow research of the small imagination types. You can't solve those problems in a year or two. And so I'm responsible, as some of you might know, for the Future Professors Program on behalf of the Minister. And what we select about 26 to 30 every year, really talented senior lecturer equivalent people from the different 26 public universities. I think so far we only identified one person in early childhood education, somebody from Nelson Mandela University. But I don't see energy. I don't see ingenuity. I don't see innovation. I don't see the kind of drive that would put these young scholars at the forefront of early education research. I just don't see that in South Africa, and it is extremely frustrating. Once every 10 years, I get a doctoral student that I just know is going to, or a postdoc who's going to blow the lights out, but they're few and far between, and I don't know why. There are certain areas or certain disciplines or fields of inquiry in which that is particularly bad. Early education, early childhood education is one of them. Another is social, another is physiotherapy, so having worked as a leader in universities and now as the president of the Academy of Science, I have a very good sense of what happens in the disciplines. And the disciplines that lead the world in South Africa are disciplines like chemistry, and medicine, in particular universities, not all universities, and the natural sciences more broadly, but very, very seldom do you find these emerging giants in the field of education broadly, certainly not in the field of early childhood education. So I'm an institution builder. I know several of you are institution builders. And what that means for me is that we need to think about how to elevate over 10, 15 years research in early childhood education on the backs of the most promising. Take them out of the system, give them major training, place them in institutes for advanced studies, and I can help you with that around the world. But somehow there needs to be a leadership, beyond Linda and Asina and others that are going to transform this enterprise called early education research. And I'm quite happy, even though this is not my field of expertise, I'm quite happy to help set that up and raise the funding for it. So that, I think as senior scholars, our most important role is to make sure that we are replaced by people who are better than us. And if you don't do that, I think you don't know why you're here. And I would want to propose that as a very serious commitment that we have and should have if we are going to make a dent in social and educational research in South Africa. So in summary, the problem of small imaginations, of normative bent, of polycentric bias, of nationalistic orientation, of the critical unconscious, of immediatism, and of the juniorization of the academy insofar as we are talking about early education research. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Prof, for an immensely insightful presentation. I think you've shaken us all up and given us 7 very important points to address and consider, certainly if we want to see ECE move forward. I see my deputy Nasima Sheikh has her hand up. So Nasima, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julieta, and thank you very much, Prof Jansen, for that very inspiring presentation that I'm sure most of us can resonate with. There is one question that I would like to ask regarding a very important point that you raised on the problem of juniorification, if I could call it that, a serious lack of senior researchers, rated researchers in ECC. And yes, I do agree with you around I'm not sure if I completely agree with you on the lack of drive or the lack of genuity in terms of, striving towards a senior or, a strong scholarly group. With the recent projects on peace, we've done that on the project for inclusive education and care, and of course on the transformative pedagogy project. But what I would like to ask of you is, would there be any possibilities in your capacity as the leader in developing the professoriate in early childhood education, what opportunities could you offer us on SARIESI to develop future professors program in relation to developing, those possible senior ECC researchers, or even those developing ones, as we need to up this game on the A-rated, C-rated, and professors. So I need to know what opportunities are there for SARIESI to be engaged in the future professors program, because some of us have applied, we were accepted, and then we just dropped. We were just suddenly told, no, you do not fall part of the program. But I would like to know, how do these doors open for us as early childhood researchers? Thank you.
Thank you, Nasima. Good to hear you. I just want to clarify something that doesn't make sense to me. You said you were accepted and then you were dropped. How does that happen?
I don't understand that as well. I wasn't officially told. I just heard through the grapevine that I was accepted. And then somebody else had taken my place at the university, who was actually not even early childhood. She was an FET person. So I was really, really surprised.
Okay, that's got nothing to do with me. Let me tell you how this works. So the institutions, the 26 institutions, right? They have to submit. So that, let's say CPUT gets 20 applications, they then have to submit 2 or 3, I forget, or 5, to us to consider. Now, in that process, the institution itself decides who goes forward, for us to consider, and that we have no control over that. So that might be what you're talking about. But when it comes to whatever we get from the 26 institutions, we have a very thorough process with very senior, all A-rated people who sit through and make decisions on who gets accepted into the program, and so on. So I just want to clarify that, because I would like more applications. As I said, we've only had 1 application that I can recall from ECD. That was the NMU colleague. What I do propose you do as an organization, this is now not about the individuals in their institutions, but about an organizational response. If your organization says, you know what, we have identified in the sector 5 really, really promising young scholars, senior lecturer equivalents that we think could benefit from this program, I would be open to you writing to me and saying, look, we will send them through. The institutions hopefully will send them through to you. But if they don't get through on that ticket, how about we have 5, and I have to keep the numbers small, who participate in all your programs as, as associates or something like that, and not the full-term fellows. That would be perfectly possible. In other words, you get part of the training, you become part of the NRF rating review. In other words, we assess each of you in relation to the NRF criteria, and you might even be considered for the overseas placement. I would be open to that kind of proposal. I take it to the advisory board, to the management committee and the advisory board, and say, listen, we've got to see whether we can boost early education specialists here, and here's 5 people that I think could be associates of the program. That's one thing. As I said, they should still apply through the institutions, and hopefully the institutions put their names forward. But if not, I would be open to considering having that small group, because as I said, you have to develop over 10 to 15 years outstanding scholars. And by outstanding, I don't mean outstanding in South Africa. That's too easy. Outstanding in the world. You must be known in the world and I don't see that yet. And I'd be happy to take that possibility.
Thank you so much. I think that is a real step forward for us as an organization, in that we can develop a proposal and forward it to you in terms of enhancing the professoriate, and taking that's one great stride that I think would be very, very welcoming for us. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Prof, I have a question from Kerry Lee Schneider. She's asking, and it builds on Nasima's question, is there any possibilities for connection and collaboration with young and emerging scholars in the private sector? So obviously at the moment what you're speaking to is government-run universities, but as you're aware, there are plenty of private universities doing excellent work that have emerging scholars, but we don't get the same sort of support. So yeah, if you'd like to respond to that.
I don't know if there's a lot of private universities. I don't know of any, except perhaps, and it's not even called a university, which is Advotech's takeover of Monash, which is a small independent institute of education. And then I don't know if this Afrikaans organization, academia or something, as early childhood. Anyway, I'm not aware, but there's not a lot. I mean, there's not and remember, their preoccupation is not research. Their preoccupation as private academies is teaching, just by virtue of, certainly in the case of the institute being, profit-making entity. So I don't know, because the FPP is funded by government, you can imagine that they are reluctant to consider private sector campuses in this regard.
Yes, and I think that it also raises the question, Rebecca, I have seen your hand, I'll attend to you now. It does also raise a question of people in the NPO sector, because more and more people in the NPO sector are actually doing research, are actually responding to that quest you put forward of long-term research. They get involved in 3 to 5 year projects. Very rich information comes through, and they're starting to develop that into research that gets out into the universe. So again, you'll see up and coming researchers in that sector, but they're again not getting the acknowledgement because they're not in a public university. So I think we have to recognize we need to start opening the doors to private sector and NPO sector, because I think you're going to see there are a lot of very good researchers in both of those spaces who also need those opportunities.
Yeah, can I just say something about that?
Yes.
You're quite right, of course. I'm thinking of these of Eric Atmore has an excellent group of young women researchers there that I've been privileged to work with. The way to do this, though, because we don't, I mean, the Future Professors program does not work with the science councils, which I think is an even stronger case, like the HSRC or the Medical Research Council, etc. Nor do we work, obviously, with the privates. But one way to do that is to look for an affiliate position at the university. If you're doing really hot button research, find an affiliation at a university, and then it makes it easier for you to come in under that umbrella.
Right. Thank you for that tip. Rebecca, sorry to keep you waiting. Rebecca, you have a question for Prof?
I do. Good morning, Prof. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca. I'm from Smart Start. Thank you so much for the lecture. It has given me huge amounts of food for thought, and I shall be watching it again once we receive the recording. I'm trying to wrap my head around some of the intersections between your points 3 to 5 in particular. And this point you made about the missionary orientated helping hand kind of lens that people can bring to research. And I mean, I would say it goes beyond the research. That lens is pervasive in the sector. It affects how we solution in the sector. And when we try to look abroad to other countries, when we try to get beyond this nationalistic orientation that you talked about, we see that where countries have leveled up access to ECT opportunities and where there has been progress towards equalisation of early childhood outcomes, that has frequently been done through systems level interventions that are policy led. And they sometimes come through the legislative framework, but they are invariably policy led and supported by significant budgetary decisions. And as we try to, at Smart Start, try to devise and develop systems solutions to the problems of we want pockets of change and pockets of benefit. We want population level change. I'm just really curious to see how that can happen if it isn't through policy, that it's going to have to be through policy. And I think that is why we default to focusing on policy, because we realise that that is where the transformation is going to occur for us to achieve the population level changes that we seek, and for us to move away from this philanthropic third sector, which for me is also a hangover of colonialism. So I'm trying to get my head around the intersection between those 2 points. I just wonder if it's because I'm misunderstanding what you're saying about the fact that policy won't fix things. Because my feeling is that policy must fix things, because otherwise we're never going to see population level change.
Yeah, Rebecca, I can be easily convinced that you're right about that policy level, state directed investments in early childhood is the game changer. I'm convinced about that. But that's not the government we have. The government we have is singularly ill-disposed towards early childhood education and to the education of younger children in general, and to education of Black people, period. Okay, so ask yourself this question. What is the simplest thing from an engineering point of view to solve in this country? It's replacing pit latrine toilets with decent, dignified toiletry facilities. It's very easy. As I chair the board of education for Toyota, we literally fixed it in every school where Toyota has employees in KZN. Just, it takes about 3 months because of the water systems that we take care. So ask yourself, why does the government, like ours, not do that? Because they don't care a damn. So at some point, okay, I have had to make a calculation that the overinvestment, and I've written a lot about this, the overinvestment in the symbolic functions of policy at the level of government means that to put your energy there, both as an activist in the sector or as a researcher, is a waste of time. You're not going to get it because it doesn't care, and therefore this is not because of something inherently flawed within policy-centric thinking. That's not where I'm coming from. It's a political analysis of where are you more likely to get bang for your buck? Where are you more likely to see the change? And the change is not going to happen to the government because it honestly doesn't care. If more than half of the kids drop out between grades 2 and 12, and Angie tells you the matric results are wonderful, then you know you've got a problem. Okay, so it's more of sort of saying, like Richard Elmore once said in his strategy called backward mapping, instead of starting with a policy and looking for downstream effects. How about we start with the practice, okay? And then look back at what policy did or didn't do. So it's more that orientation to research rather than one that overly invests in the good intentions of government.
Right, thank you, Rebecca. Thanks, Prof. Any other questions for Prof? He's raised a lot of contentious issues here. I'm sure we need some more responses, or perhaps everybody is in stunned silence, Prof. I think you've shaken us all up. Oh, dear. Okay, there we go. Mary Clasquin-Johnson. Mary, would you like to raise your question?
Good morning, Professor Jansen and colleagues. You know, I listened to your presentation, and I kept going, ouch. I was literally sitting here flinching. And I think I had to, like, you know, immediately admit that so much of what you were saying applies to me. And like others, I've applied for the Future Professors Program. And I think, you know, yesterday I was in a meeting where the majority of the people in the meeting were trying to take early retirement or contemplating opting out. And there's this real sense that this is hard. And many of us don't lack the motivation or the commitment, but rather the support. And I'm trying to, you know, reconcile in my own mind the pressure and the support that we receive. So I'm at UNISA, and in a typical year, I have over 12,000 students. And I'm asking myself the question, how do I do this kind of, you know, what did you call it? The mind-blowing research when there's so little support for it. So I like what you're saying about exploring how within SARA-ECE we can be part of a program, even if it's on an associate basis, because the reality is that we are not breaking down the barriers that we are confronted with within our institutions. You know, we do have real barriers in terms of time and teaching loads. And that's not an excuse. I mean, I'm someone that's really privileged. At the moment, I'm on research leave, but my teaching load keeps, you know, disturbing me. And I would be irresponsible if I didn't react to that pressure and went back from leave to chaos. So the person who's replaced me is brand new in the institution on contract, and I cannot allow my students to be compromised. So that's the tension. You know, how do we tick all the boxes on our performance management agreements with our institutions and still find the time? And Prof Jansen, you know that as women within early childhood, we have all the domestic and child rearing, and in COVID that's been intensified, right? So I would like you to give us some, you know, like, if possible with respect, some reassurance that this is not as impossible as what it's feeling. Well, to me personally, I can't speak for my colleagues here, but I do know from my interactions with colleagues at how, I think, frustrated we feel and how much of a struggle this is. So thank you for the opportunity to share that with you.
Mary, it is good to hear you. I feel quite emotional about what you're saying. Oh my God. Let me just say this. If you at UNISA, which is a highly dysfunctional university at the moment, you will see that in the task scheme report to the minister that Vincent Mapai just completed with his team. It is a highly dysfunctional university. How it still can be called the university is beyond me. And one of the consequences of that is an incredible stress that is placed on the academic faculty, the academic community. I know this through not just what I know in these reports, but also because of the study we did, as some of you might know. I was simply the PI, but the study was led by women researchers. Some of them were single mothers and others, and we got almost 3,000, I think, researchers, women researchers, responding to academic work under COVID conditions. If you read those stories from UNISA women, you will be traumatized. I promise you that. So what you say is heartbreaking. What you say is real. What you say is, you don't have to convince me. I know that. So I'm going to be blunt with you, Mary. The chances of you doing what I just said now is impossible if you have oversight for 12,000 students. My God, it's impossible. Okay, so either you have to change the institution you work for. I'm sorry to say that, or or do this if you're independently wealthy. Just do this as a research associate somewhere. But I'm not a woman, but I tell you, I've read enough stuff here to know that this is serious stuff. So I can't give you hope if the institutional conditions under which you work doesn't change. Okay, I'm hoping that the new vice chancellor, I wish you the best. I just can't imagine one person changing an inherently corrupt institution. And I say that openly because I can back it up with facts, because the demoralization of the academic staff at UNISA is unprecedented in the history of South African institutions. All universities have their shit, you know that, okay? But this is next level stuff, And so I'm saying to you and Asim and everybody else, if the institutional conditions doesn't support you, okay, to become a really top flight scholar, it's not going to happen, okay? So from a bread and butter standpoint, you've got to make a living, you've got to have a job. I just don't see that UNISA as a place in which you can do that, because you're playing catch up all the time. And so having said that, as some of you know, I mentor some of you on this program. I would double up my efforts, Mary, and others, to continue to do that. But I'm also realistic. You're only able to do so much unless the institutional conditions meet some threshold, some basic threshold of decency in the support of its academics.
Thanks very much, Prof, for responding. Unfortunately, we have to bring this session to an end so that we can go on to our next session. I've noted there are quite a few questions in the comment section, so I think we will have to email those to you, Prof, and hopefully you can respond accordingly. It's sad in a way to have to end on such a negative note, but it's a very realistic note, and I think it absolutely speaks to your 7 points and why you're not seeing the things you would like to see. You are speaking to a community of very overworked, overstretched academics who really do have the will for change, but are severely hampered by their work environments. But this is something that's a conversation for a whole other stakeholders meeting, I fear. Prof, thank you so much. I think you've given us incredible food for thought. I hope you'll join us at the next link if you are available. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.